Hello, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Yasha Zarrinkelk. I am the coalition organizer and manager of Transit Forward Philadelphia. We're a advocacy coalition based here in Philadelphia advocating for a better public transit system. I'll be moderating today's discussion. The focus of our conversation will kind of be on what role independent groups can play in supporting transit and advancing equity. I want to introduce our speakers today. Greg, would you like to go first?
Sure, Yasha. Greg Krykewycz. I'm Associate Director of Multimodal Planning at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. We are the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Greater Philadelphia. So we serve the city of Philadelphia and 4 suburban counties in southeastern PA and 4 suburban counties in South Jersey. And what organizations like ours around the country are charged with doing is making sure that the federal and state funds that are spent on transportation are spent in a coordinated way that is consistent with sort of a long-range vision for growth and development in the region. And what I do specifically at DVRPC is multimodal planning. So a lot of planning around transit, bicycle, and pedestrian improvements, a lot of planning around encouraging people to do things other than driving alone in their cars. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Sounds like you do great work, Greg. Thank you. Kelley, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm Kelley Yemen. I'm the Director of Complete Streets for the City of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability. Within my office, we work on Vision Zero, the work to get towards zero fatalities on our roadways. So that's a lot of safety improvements for biking, walking, encouraging people to use transit as some of the safest modes in the city. So we have our bike and ped program, transit policy planning, safe routes to school, working with kids, really looking for a breadth of, again, like Greg said, how do we encourage people to and make it easy for people to use different modes to get around the city? So it's not just got to be available, but easy and comfortable for people to try biking, walking, and riding transit as part of their everyday lives.
Thank you, Kelley. It sounds like you're also doing very important work here in Philadelphia. And just a little bit more about our coalition, Transit Forward Philly. I think, to kind of add on to what Greg and Kelley mentioned, that not only trying to get people to, out of their cars and using multimodal transportation, but also making sure that those multimodal modes of transportation are accessible to everyone, right? And that it's reaching groups that maybe are historically left out of these conversations. So like low income communities, communities of color, persons ages 55 and older, or persons with disabilities. So with that being said, I just wanted to propose a question to the group. And the first one kind of being, how do we build and maintain synergy between Philadelphia's transit systems, economic growth drivers, and workers? And I'll just leave that open to the group, whoever would like to kind of take on that question.
I guess I can take an initial initial crack at that one. It's kind of a big question. I think sometimes the private sector and especially folks that are making decisions around business locations and development sometimes think of transportation infrastructure and public transit specifically as something that's sort of just out there as a silo that's hard to engage with. And if they're thinking about transportation access related to their investments, they're thinking about it sort of late in the game when a lot of decisions are already made. And so I think one of the things that would help in general, and one of the things I think is pretty cool about GPlex is in connecting people across different sectors so that folks in the development space get to know people in the transportation space and in the transit space specifically and make those connections and maybe think about connecting with those folks, leveraging those relationships earlier when making investment decisions so that especially if you're thinking about locating a new development, for example, maybe locate that new development where the service already exists, where the infrastructure already exists, as opposed to locating it where the land might be cheaper and the labor might be cheaper, but you sort of hope that the transportation comes and meets you there, and that's a lot harder to do. and a lot harder to sustain as a network. So I think that's one thing I would start with.
Kelley, sorry, before we jump into you, Greg, it just sounds like that transportation and land use connection is super important and super critical, and a way that Gplex kind of, helps connect those two fields or stakeholders. So I think that's great.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to follow up on that, or?
I mean, if you had any,
yeah, I mean,
Kelley, you wanted to.
I agree. I completely agree. Like a lot of times, we have a lot of times there's sort of lifeline programs established to connect, for example, urban residents to suburban job locations and like new kind of growing warehouse sectors. And that's something that's come up in our Gplex tracks discussions as well, in particular. And those are just really hard connections to make because those warehouse jobs, for example, tend to be located in lower density parts of the city, lower density parts of the region that are hard to get to. And if you can get transit there, it's going to cost a whole lot per rider to get that connection there. And so ultimately, when you talk about mobility equity, if you don't have access to a car, you don't have reliable access to a car, it's essentially a metaphor that I always use and then immediately regret using, but I'm going to do it again. It's like the solutions that we have are often feel like a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, because we have this like really fundamental structural land use problem where the jobs just aren't located where the workers are, for the most part, especially the disadvantaged workers. And the solutions that we have as transportation planners are just feel very frail and sort of wildly insufficient compared to the scale of the problem. And so if those jobs can be located more smartly, from my perspective, in like where the infrastructure is, where the transportation service is, where the transit service is, and where it can be provided efficiently, it just makes everything else just kind of works. But as long as those commercial location decisions are made in a way that doesn't consider transportation access, especially for the disadvantaged, very efficiently, it's just, the solutions we have just aren't able to meet the problem.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that's where, kind of the efficiency of cities, of town centers really starts to shine, is that's where transit can operate efficiently. You can get people to jobs from their homes. And once we started kind of the sprawling mentality, you really lose a lot of the efficacy of transit service and the ability for workers to get to jobs in an efficient manner. So how we're connecting and reconnecting that lost land use transportation connection is vital for kind of smart growth of the entire region. So how do we solve some of that mismatch? And so, a lot of it's on the land use side, like Greg was saying, and we can have a lifeline service that, only hits certain warehouse areas a few times a day. Maybe it shift changes, but it doesn't create that system that really is reliable for a worker who, what happens if in the middle of the day they have to go home for a sick kid? They're stranded. And because we can only afford to serve outlying areas with a certain amount of service. So if it's more compact, in the right locations where you can have clusters of things, that really allows transit to shine and move things more efficiently. I mean, when we talk about economic growth, we talk about it in a lot of the center city congestion, university city congestion in the city. And that's a great thing. When we have congestion, that means people are there. They want to do things. They want to be in center city. They want to go to jobs. They want to go shopping. They want to do all of the different things. That means we've got economic growth. But then how do we connect both the workers and people who want to be down there and use our streets most efficiently? That's a key thing. That's one of those balancing acts we're always trying to look at. And the more people who are using transit, the better our city and our economy can grow.
Absolutely, Kelley. I really agree with you. And I also wanted to ask you, Kelley, with the Vision Zero sort of expertise that you have. We're talking a lot about accessibility, but also I think it's important to talk about safely getting people to and from work, or being able to utilize transit. And I would love to kind of hear what your opinion is in terms of, there's accessibility, there's safety, there's also sustainability, but on that safety side, and kind of what we're seeing in terms of traffic deaths and things like that, and how transit can be protecting those both workers but also underserved communities.
Yeah, I mean, we have about 85 fatalities every year in the city of Philadelphia on city streets, excluding, interstate crashes. Um, so that's 85 people. Another 250 are seriously injured, and all of those are to do with car crashes. When we look at, maybe we have 1 to 2 bus related fatalities, not always SEPTA buses, that could be an intercity bus or some other kind of larger vehicle, but a lot of those are car crashes. And if we can get people using things like transit, walking, taking short trips and turning them into walk and bike trips, getting on the bus for those work commutes. We've seen that from other cities, that as those mode shares increase, the safety on our streets increases, and we're able to bring down the fatality rates from vehicle crashes across the city.
Awesome. Awesome. So the second question I want to propose to y'all is, what role can independent groups outside of the formal transportation planning and kind of operation sectors, essentially the groups that are engaged in GPLEX, play in supporting mobility and advancing transportation equity?
Well, I think especially for a lot of the groups in GPLEX, a lot of the larger employers and other groups, it's remembering who all of your workers are. Sometimes we become so focused on the 9 to 5, the white collar, maybe the decision makers and what their commute is like, that there's a whole ecosystem of people who work for a lot of kind of the different corporations and groups out there that are shift workers. And how are they able to access and fully utilize our transit system, and then advocate for them, advocate for the full range of workers that that are involved in our economy? Because that's something that I think is a lot of times lost as we focus on the 9 to 5 commute, the peak hour. What's happening then is, well, how does somebody get home from a closing shift at 9, or a 2 a.m. start time?
And I think that's spot on. I think if, just thinking about where we are now with a virtual GPLEX, and we've got a virtual panel here, there's 2 hours I got back every day when we went remote work, when DVRPC went remote work for everything. And if you think about all those folks that Kelley was just talking about, those folks not only, they're still working those 2 hours to keep the lights on for me, or they're still traveling those 2 hours to keep the lights on for me, and for us to do all this virtual stuff. And they might have lost some of their transit service access, and they might feel sort of personally like they're putting their personal health at risk and their family's personal health at risk, because the sectors that they work in, the jobs they work at, don't lend themselves to being able to be done virtually. So this was an equity issue, all along. It's always been an equity issue, and it's even a more acute equity issue now. And one of the things that's come up in our GPLEX track is around sort of long-term structural funding challenges for transit agencies because of COVID, because people riding less, and operating costs are higher because the transit agencies are having to clean the vehicles more, and so forth. And so one of the sort of the spillover risks of that is, if the transit agencies aren't able to provide as much service as they used to, or as good at service as they used to, I'm more able to adjust to that in my life than this whole other sector of folks who work a different kind of job are. So the more people that are aware of that and thinking about that in their business decisions, and then, like Kelley said, being willing to advocate. And I think that's part of the role of an independent. I think you started by asking about independent groups, independent advocacy groups. I think talking to SEPTA board members, going to board meetings, talking to elected officials, even outside of the transit space, being willing to sort of advocate for transportation and make more decision makers aware that there's sort of broad constituencies for maintaining good transportation across modes and safe transportation across all modes, and being willing to sort of step up with funding and additional funding to help, you know, everybody to do better, I think is an important advocacy role that independent organizations can play, that folks who work at transit agencies, at DOTs, at MPOs aren't able to advocate as effectively because of the hats we wear.
Absolutely, Greg. And I think for maybe those who aren't aware, I think, you know, our coalition is that's what we're essentially here to do, is organizing, you know, various groups, you know, and various organizations or businesses or just general companies or here in Philadelphia to advocate for how their constituencies or how their workers, you know, really rely on public transit, and how important it is and how essential transit is to, you know, the economic recovery of the region, you know, curbing climate change, and just in general increasing access to all opportunities. And with all that kind of being said, I would love to hear more about how your organization partners with independent groups to increase mobility, access, and equity.
Well, I know we're very excited that Transit Forward has come into existence and is kind of starting that conversation and bringing partners together to talk about how to move transit, transportation, mobility equity, whether it's the Vision Zero Alliance, the Bike Coalition, various neighborhood groups. I think that is ways that we're always looking to work at with organizations, whether it's a kind of localized plan for a certain area of the city or kind of citywide policy. We know, as Greg was saying to the previous question, there's limits on what government can do and advocate and kind of fully talk about, especially when you're housed within a certain segment. And it's important to have organizations on the outside being able to bring up those additional points that are not kind of the role of government to always advocate for, or at least government employees.
Absolutely, absolutely. Even though there may be, you know, the desire and want, because, you know, we're all working towards the same goal. You know, there needs to be that kind of that inside outside
Mhm.
game, which is crucial. Greg, would you kind of like to speak about that as well? How your organization kind of partners with independent groups?
Yeah, I would say in some of the same ways that Kelley mentioned, just sort of in our day-to-day planning and our projects, we're always looking to make those connections and include those voices, and partnering with a lot of the same organizations that Kelley mentioned. One other, in thinking about the question, one other program in particular where we try to connect with sort of a particular constituencies, particular sort of non-governmental constituencies, is through our Equity Through Access program, which is our regional coordinated human services transportation plan. It's there are some small funding programs for those kinds of lifeline improvements that we were talking about earlier that are you know, wildly insufficient to meet the problem that they're intended to meet, but they're what we got, and so we do sort of an ongoing program of planning around those funding programs, and as part of that, we do direct engagement with seniors, with senior constituencies, with senior organizations, and with members of the disabled community and folks who work with and advocate for members of the disabled community. And that's a pretty we update that plan every 4 years, and we do some work in between on projects in that kind of address those needs, lots of projects that address those needs. And that's one of the, it's nice to be able to kind of directly work with those populations, have a sort of a formal reason to work with folks who aren't always at the table in some of our transportation conversations.
Yeah, to add on to that, I mean, I think similarly, we have a great program through our Indigo bike share kind of transit system that works and has an ambassador program working with very local neighborhood groups to get the word out about Indigo, to get riding lessons, digital access, but it's highly responsive. And I think that's sometimes what we really need is different groups like or different avenues to have that connection to communities, really get the feedback loop of what are the things, whether in bike transit, bus transit, any kind of mobility, what are the changes that are most going to help people better navigate and support their lives, whether it's better, ways for parents with strollers to use a bus, or middle-aged women to learn how to use Indigo and bike share. There's a host of just kind of how do we get into lifting up those community voices, and having that positive feedback loop of, we might not be able to solve it all, and it might be, as Greg said, wholly underfunded. But if we're not receiving that information, we won't ever be able to create the programs that might start to solve some of those solutions.
Absolutely, Kelly. And I wanted to just kind of mention, yeah, the city and Otis, they've worked so closely with so many different groups, the Bicycle Coalition being one of them, the Better Bike Share Partnership being another. I can personally speak to, I was a community liaison for the Bicycle Coalition, working for the Better Bike Share Partnership. So I was on the ground, teaching, like you said, middle-aged ladies here in Philadelphia how to ride an Indigo bike. And they were all classes that were provided for free. There was also like a digital literacy class along with bicycle skills that just had a huge amount of engagement and excitement about the program. And the city did a really great job at kind of, targeting specific communities where bike transit could really serve them to get them where they need to go. So it was really awesome. And Greg, same thing, with DVRPC and their like equity through access, toolkit that they all have online that kind of spells out areas where, transit equity, might need a little bit of strengthening, and in specific neighborhoods where, accessibility and safety maybe, need improvement, which I think is really, really great and really, really awesome, and kind of a testament to, what your organizations are doing. For my last question, I would just love to know, where could independent groups, do you think, be most helpful? And you kind of maybe have already touched on that earlier, but maybe we can kind of dig into a little bit more of the details about how they can be most effective.
I mean, I would say I think there's kind of different levels to how they can be effective, and some of it is the advocacy, the big funding questions, needing more voices at the table in the region, understanding and advocating for better transit, better transportation policy, and funding within the whole kind of greater Philadelphia area. At a kind of middle level within any organization, how are employees being thought about with their transportation needs? How's that being managed? Whether it's shift changes to lighten the load on things, understanding as far as a bus is 5 minutes late and you don't want to overly penalize a shift worker for that, or supporting the transit to ensure the workers can easily get to work, or and then on the local level, really, I think the work around kind of these programs of how do you engage with the community, how do you create those positive feedback loops that help people navigate what can be a maze sometimes, especially if you're new to whether it's biking on an Indigo or new to using transit. How do we get the feedback loop that we need to be making access improvements for groups that don't feel that transit is accessible to them today? I think that kind of outreach and then advocacy for those programs is also key.
Yeah, I think that's all. I agree with. We're saying a lot. Kelly and I often agree, I guess. So that's good. I think you. What's that?
That's why we work well together.
That's why we work well together.
Yeah.
We have a meeting. We have a meeting right after this, actually. I think the last thing that Kelly said, I sort of. I don't know if you said this, Kelly, but I thought of like a bridge organization. I think that's where a lot of sort of independent advocacy organizations, in particular, that like a bridge in all sorts of different ways. And Kelly talked about relationship building with the community, and I think that's a really important bridge that. A lot of times, we hopefully you're hearing what we think, and you think we're trying to do good work. We're not in this to get rich. We're in this because we don't really believe in this stuff. And it's easy for us to sort of trust that's true, but for a community that doesn't work with a city organization or doesn't work with a transit agency or might even actively have reasons to actively distrust, anything public. There's all sorts of, there's immigrant communities that don't even want to ride public transit. They'll go out of their way to ride a private jitney or to pay out the nose for a taxi fare because they know that nobody's gonna check their papers, ask for their papers. They don't trust that that's true with anything that's attached to public infrastructure. And so I think independent organizations can sort of bridge the gap between our institutional infrastructure and those kinds of those communities that kind of need the support the most, and that we really want to hear from in terms of what their transportation needs are and what their priorities are, but we really have a ton of time reaching. I feel like independent organizations can reach those communities a lot more effectively and then translate their needs to the public decision makers. And getting back to where Kelley started on funding advocacy, that's obviously a big piece of it. We're an older city, an older region in terms of infrastructure. We've got a lot of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, and that takes up almost all of our transportation funding. So if we want to make things better, we do need more resources to do more stuff. But I think it's kind of cheap to just advocate for more money, because you sort of have to build the case that there's a constituency there that's worth the elected officials sticking their neck out for more funding. And that's where kind of demonstrating what we talked about earlier, that kind of proof of constituencies, proof of value, that even if they're not hearing from riders day to day, if they're not hearing from pedestrians and bicyclists day to day, that elected officials need to know that there's a huge constituency around mobility improvements, and independent organizations, private sector organizations can make that case with a different voice than public sector staff can, for sure.
That's awesome. And I think that was very well said by both of you. I would love to give, each of you, if there's anything else that you felt was important to kind of share, or just to kind of close this out. I mean, I think both of you did a really great job at kind of covering the whole field, but I just wanted to give y'all a minute to close and say anything else that you think might be important in terms of trying to push transit equity here in Philadelphia.
I guess I'll start since Kelley started. I'll buy you some time, Kelley, if you want to. Kelley's started the last couple. I just think it's a really, it's a really weird time. Again, this is virtual. We're all virtual. And it's easy to kind of take that for granted 8 or 9 months in, or whatever it is. But I feel like it's really an unusual period of time when everything in the transportation space sort of gets, like, the whole deck of cards gets thrown on the ground and scattered, and we're not quite sure how it's going to come back together again. And so that's a time of tremendous threat and change for, like, sort of transportation institutions. But it's also kind of a time when maybe we can be creative, and organizations that might have in normal times be a little bit more bureaucratically sort of have a lot of inertia and reluctance to change. There's sort of a need to change and a need to be open to change. And so I think this is a good, this GPLEX right now, and a lot of our work this year is about sort of trying to understand what's going on, make our best guess of how the dust is going to settle on the other side of this thing, and hopefully, things are going to be different, but hopefully different in a lot of better ways, so we can find some silver linings through this period of change.
Yeah, I'll build on what Greg was saying. I mean, I think this is a huge amount of change, and it can be terrifying, but it can also be a huge opportunity for us to take a pause and think about, what we've learned, what do we want the city and the region to really look like, from multiple different perspectives, as we start to reopen and reimagine what and how our city operates. And that includes transportation. Who are we serving? How are we serving them? And how can we do that better? Because we could let inertia carry us forward and have one outcome or action and advocacy from both inside and outside government to push for a different future. And that can have kind of safety, sustainability, equity, all sorts of different health impacts as we think about how people move around and what does that mean for them as we're all in our homes for a while, as we start to come back out, what do we want to look like?
Awesome.
It's a good moment for that and for this conversation at Duplex.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you, Greg and Kelley, for joining us today. Your insights were super helpful, and I'm really looking forward to, the implementations of these relationships and how independent groups can kind of, increase mobility, access, and equity. So thank you so much.